Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Oh, yeah. Welcome to another edition of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston. No, I have not yet listened to Taylor's new album, but I have heard of Bad Bunny, and no, I'm not freaking out that he'll be this year's Super Bowl halftime show, unlike the white Christian nationalist MAGA Republican Party. Remember, some of these same people probably had no problem jamming to Carlos Santana's Oye Como Va when they were in high school, or for the Gen X MAGA Republicans, they probably jammed to Insane in the Membrane by Cypress Hill, and even more, they probably jammed to Gerardo's Rico Suave and had no problem doing it. I'll have more to say about that in this week's last call. Coming up here in a few moments, Jess Newman from the Ballot initiative push called Invest in My Kids will join me. The initiative's language passed the State Board of Commissioners recently, and supporters are now collecting signatures to put the initiative on the ballot. And if you're wondering, Invest in My Kids is a constitutional amendment proposal that would raise $1 billion per year for Michigan's public schools. And they do it not by raising taxes that working class Michiganders would have to pay, like, the new marijuana taxes, but they do it by raising taxes on the state's top income earners to help make things not just a bit more equitable in the state, but to help invest in our schools. More on that here in just a moment. Just before pressing the record button, I ran across another fantastic essay by a Colorado progressive writer that I follow who goes by the name of Joe Wrote. And this time, Joe wrote about how Democratic centrists are anything but moderates. If anything, these centrists have shrunk the Democratic Party's voting base by being too extreme, too outside of the mainstream. In his closing paragraph in his essay titled Centrists Shrank the Democratic Tent, Only the Left Can Expand It, Joe said the following, and I quote, "There, by the way, centrist influencers and writers like Tim Miller, Ezra Klein, and Matthew Iglesias, they're crying foul. Because centrist liberalism has nowhere else to go. It has nothing else to offer America, not even its once intriguing promise of blocking Republican fascism from taking over." That's true. There is no one to blame but themselves. If left in place, the Democratic establishment will continue to shrink the coalition, leaving the nation unprotected from the worst threat to safety and security in my lifetime. It'll be difficult, but I think we should try to stop them. Well, and that's part of the reason why I decided to start this podcast. Yes, I started it to reverse the awful trend of 40 years of MAGA Michigan Republicans owning at least one branch of the state government and its complete stranglehold on the state trifecta from 2010 through 2018. Yes, I started this podcast as also a way to present a strong opposition and real voice for the working class and for freedom after Dear Leader won in 2016. But I also started this to help highlight and push for a stronger and more popular progressive agenda, not just to win over independents, but to take over the Democratic Party. Now, Joe Wrote is absolutely on the money when he says these Democratic centrists and corporatists have no one to blame but themselves for the Democratic Party's failures, especially its failure with working class Americans. And when I say working class Americans, I mean everyone who's not in the oligarch class, the connected class, the cocktail circuit class, the donor class, the untouchable class. The rest of us are all in the working class. More and more workers are living paycheck to paycheck nowadays. CBS News reports this week, according to a Goldman Sachs study, roughly 42% of younger Americans, spanning Gen Z, millennials, and my generation, Gen X, report having no spare savings after covering their basic living expenses, according to the analysis, which surveyed around 3,600 workers and 1,500 retirees. Among those just getting by, about 3/4 said they're struggling to save for retirement. 3/4 said that they are struggling to save for retirement. Now, when the same survey was done back in 1997, the number of Americans living paycheck to paycheck was 31%. And the survey predicts that the number of Americans living paycheck to paycheck will swell over 50% by the year 2033. By the way, I'm wondering who an investment bank like Goldman Sachs backed in the last election. I wonder. Another great progressive Substack called The Farce, run by Michigan progressive activist LOL GOP, shared a Fortune magazine article on how a new Fannie Mae survey reveals a stark yet unsurprising truth. Nearly 70% of America believes the economy is headed in the wrong direction. That's the reality of the situation. Oh yes, the Trump regime is telling everyone, wait till next year, but with people living paycheck to paycheck, waiting until next year might be too late. And that Fortune magazine article said the same survey revealed that 73% say it is now a bad time to buy a house. And listen to this part from NBC News last spring. The median age of first-time home buyers hit 38 last year. 38 years old last year, up from 35 in 2023, and almost a decade older than in the 1980s when the typical home buyer was just 29 years old, the National Association of Realtors reported late last year. Home ownership rates for Gen Z and millennials stalled in 2024. Everyone, the working class is getting squeezed. And no one, especially not dear leader Trump and the regime or their MAGA Republican majority in Congress, are willing to help as the government remains in shutdown mode. And doesn't it really warm your hearts a bit knowing that Michigan MAGA Republicans in Congress are getting paid for not working at all as the government is shut down due to their insistence of not helping working class Michiganders and Americans afford their Medicaid and their health care? The Trump regime's health care shutdown is on right now because congressional Democrats, in a shockingly good and strong move, I must say, are refusing to pass along a budget resolution unless the Trump regime and MAGA Republicans agree to reversing the Medicaid cuts they passed last summer and that they agreed to provide tax credits for expiring Obamacare subsidies. However, I think I just read somewhere, I think that was also NBC News, that MAGA Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is calling for action on these expiring subsidies. So maybe, just maybe, the heat is working a little bit and some cracks in that MAGA facade are starting to show. Maybe. I mean, it is such an easy thing to do, and it doesn't really make sense for Michigan MAGA Republican Congresswoman Lisa McClain from the Thumb region to stand up there with her stupid, goofy, smiling face with MAGA House Speaker Mike Johnson as he argues why blocking thousands of your constituents from obtaining affordable health care is the best thing to do. Jennifer Schutt from Michigan Advance wrote the following here recently. She said, more than 78% of people surveyed by the nonpartisan health organization KFF in late September said they want lawmakers to keep the enhanced credits. Their extension has become a major linchpin in the debate about the government shutdown. When broken down by political party, 92% of Democrats and 82% of independents and 59% of Republicans support renewing the tax credits. Within the Republican Party, 57% of people identified as supporting Trump's MAGA cause and policies, and 70% of GOP voters who identified as non-MAGA supporters want to see the tax credits extended, according to that poll. Again, it does not make much political sense to oppose any restoration of these Medicaid cuts or to extend these Obamacare subsidies. Lisa McClain, Bill Huizenga, Jack Bergman, John James, or Tom Barrett. It doesn't make much political sense whatsoever. And look, I agree that the subsidy part of Obamacare didn't really help lower costs, even though the banning of insurance companies from blocking people with pre-existing conditions was always a no-brainer and one of the best parts of Obamacare. But that's why we need Medicare for all. And it's not difficult to understand why more and more Americans are demanding it. Going back to that article by Joe Rote, he cites an Economist YouGov poll from a month ago showing strong support for Medicare for all. He writes, in July, The Economist, which was once accurately described as a silly journal that speaks for British millionaires, found 59% of Americans and 57% of independents want Medicare for all. In a hypothetical matchup between a pro-MFA Democrat and an anti-MFA Republican, the Democrat would start with a 32-point lead on a central health care issue. So, for those centrists out there, those centrist/corporate Democrats who believe that everyone is in love with their health care, think again. And declaring a need for a public option, it isn't enough, Senator Slotkin. So while I and millions of others are happy how congressional Democrats are holding the line in this budget fight, it always seems like Democrats are having to play defense and preserving something rather than fighting to make things even better. Because we always knew this was in the MAGA Republican playbook known as Project 2025, despite the corporate media assuring us that Dear Leader had no idea what was in that book, which, hey, may have been true since it wasn't a picture book. We knew the people hovering around Dear Leader as he continues to mentally decline right in front of us. We knew that those people would be running the show, like Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. And as LOL GOP said in his farce essay that I just mentioned a few moments ago, the economic goal this whole time wasn't to enhance the working class. It was to enhance the financial grip and power for those in the oligarch class, the corporate authoritarian class. Yeah, the stock market keeps going through the roof despite 70% of Americans saying the economy is not working for them. The Trump regime's cryptocurrency deals are making the Trump family and that entire industry more rich and more powerful. It's not helping 70% of America out there. Job draining and environmentally damaging data centers are driving up electricity costs, not to mention taking taxpayer money as states like Michigan are providing corporate welfare in the tens of hundreds of millions of dollars to lure these companies like Google, like Meta, to set up shop here. The regime and MAGA Republicans, through their MAGA murder budget, aren't only gutting Medicaid and food programs, but they are shuttering thousands of clean energy jobs here in the state. The regime is considering pulling $500 million to convert a GM plant into an EV plant at the Lansing Grand River Assembly Plant. And Michigan voted for him. Compound that with how his tariffs are hurting small businesses, how fewer Canadians are bringing their tourist dollars to the state, and how farmers are suffering while the regime grants $20 billion in bailout money to a MAGA president in Argentina. Yeah, you understand how the regime was never about the working class. The regime and its corporate authoritarian backers are banking that he'll gain just enough dictatorial power by the time this economy implodes, and it's going to happen. And by that time, it'll be too late. And maybe I'm giving them, the people in the regime, maybe I'm giving them too much credit, and maybe they are feeble-minded, insecure little men, as AOC says that they are. And I do agree with that assessment in some part, but we're watching authoritarianism in real time. And the centrists are the ones to blame for bringing us this close to the edge. I know that's why a person like Zoran Mamdani is leading his mayoral race in New York City. The people are tired being lied to and tired living paycheck to paycheck. And I think that same anger and despair is already affecting Michigan's important electoral races next year, including the governor's and the United States Senator races. Because last week I covered how Democratic Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist described what was happening in Gaza as a genocide inflicted on the Palestinian people by the MAGA right-wing Israeli government run by Benjamin Netanyahu. And that was big news because Gilchrist, of course, is running in the Democratic primary for governor next year. None of the other Democratic candidates have called what's happening in Gaza a genocide. Now, in the U.S. Senate Democratic primary fight, Medicare for All and working class advocate Dr. Abdul El-Sayed has already stated unequivocally that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute a genocide. And then, last weekend, during a campaign event, Democratic State Senator Mallory McMorrow, who's also one of the 3 Democrats running for the Senate nomination, finally called what's happening in Gaza a genocide. Here's how Ben Solis described it in Michigan Advance. The state senator from Royal Oak took a question about Gaza from a voter and was asked if Israel was committing a genocide on the Palestinian people. And now I'm going to quote from the story. McMorrow, after a deep breath and long pause, said it was, by definition, a genocide. We have Benjamin Netanyahu trying to tell us what we've been seeing with our own eyes is not true. It is true, and two things can be true at once, she said. Now, McMorrow condemned the Hamas terror attack 2 years ago this week, in which over 1,000 Israelis were slaughtered, with hundreds being taken hostage by Hamas. But she said that Netanyahu's actions were just as horrendous. Well, I'd say maybe a little worse, since the number of Palestinians killed so far is much greater, especially among women and children. But yes, of course, Hamas was evil in what it did, and Netanyahu is always willing to go the extra steps in devastating and killing the Palestinian people, with American money, by the way. And look, regardless of what you think of McMorrow's shifting position on Gaza, her announcement means only corporate Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens, the third Senate candidate in this Democratic race, she's the only one who has refused to criticize the Israeli government whatsoever, and she still accepts AIPAC money. McMorrow did state also in that appearance that she would not accept AIPAC money. We'll see. But that goes back to how the left is actually expanding the tent for Democrats. Had Kamala Harris called Israel's action genocidal and promised to block further weapons to Israel, she would have captured the Arab American vote, a large majority of it in Michigan, by the way. Not to mention, she probably would have captured many Gen Z voters who probably sat out the election. Instead, Harris sent Bill Clinton here with the Jeffrey Epstein files hanging over him, just as it is with Dear Leader, of course. And that's when Bill said that Gazans basically had it coming to them. In Michigan, he said that. That sort of centrist framing, guess what? Did not expand the tent whatsoever. No, it shrunk the tent. And thanks to the progressive position, which enjoys strong majorities in poll after poll after poll, Americans not only believe Israel's committing a genocide, but Americans believe that we should put an arms blockade on Israel until it stops. That is what you call expanding the tent. Another way of expanding the tent is by representing the working class Michiganders. And the budget bill just signed into law by Governor Gretchen Whitmer, it saves some working class agenda items while also hurting the working class. I know. MAGA Republicans have the House, and we're naturally going to get some things they wanted. I'm under no illusion about that. But like I stated last week, that 24% tax on marijuana purchases are again a working class tax that will not only shutter some pot shops, but it'll force some to just go buy pot in the black market, while also discouraging out-of-staters to want to drive in and stop in and visit some marijuana shops. So I wonder if we're really going to raise all kinds of money off that tax. And it's all being done to help fund roads, because we can't even dare mention maybe raising taxes on the upper class here in the state. No. And of course, there was also an agreement to eliminate taxes on overtime and Social Security income, which, amounts to $190 million from the budget. And while I'm not thrilled about it, there are other ways to raise revenue. As for the school budget, it's good that Michigan Democrats held the line on the popular free meal program in public schools, and per pupil funding increased by 4%. However, millions of dollars were drained in this budget from public schools to help pay for private schools, which I don't know about you, but I thought was unconstitutional here in the state. But this new spending on education in the state, it's just the start. Yes, funding increases over the last few years are helping public schools, but we experienced about a 12-year gap where Michigan's spending on education became one of the worst in the nation. And we wonder why test scores are dropping and teacher shortages exist. Well, you don't have to wonder why. That's why it's going to take a major reinvestment in our schools once again to catch up where we should be today in terms of spending. And that's what the Invest in My Kids ballot proposal is hoping to accomplish by raising $1 billion per year for public schools alone across the state. Jess Newman from Invest in My Kids is coming up right after this break to talk more about it. You're listening to LOL.
It's the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. Need to give Pat a piece of your mind? Or do you have some stories you think Pat should cover? Email him at leftoflansing@gmail.com. And if you have Michigan beer ideas for Pat, he'll love you even more. Now, here's Pat.
Thanks again to our show voice, Jessica, for always doing such an outstanding job here each and every week. Thanks to all of your comments that you send to me via email. That's leftoflansing@gmail.com. And, of course, the comments that you leave for me on Blue Sky, Facebook, the Gram, and Twitter. Remember to subscribe and give the show a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to help spread the progressive message throughout Michigan and, of course, throughout the rest of the nation. All right. Last week, we covered the push to make Michigan the next ranked choice voting state with Joe Spalding, who's part of the Rank My Vote coalition, to let voters decide on that issue on the 2026 ballot. I wanted to cover another crucial initiative here this week that might be on next year's ballot, and that's the Invest in My Kids ballot proposal. Now, language for that proposal received the green light a couple of months ago from the Board of Canvassers here in the state, and as I'm speaking, volunteers are collecting signatures to put the issue on the 2026 ballot so that we, the voters, will get the chance to vote on this possible future funding mechanism for our public schools, which have been severely defunded for far too many years. Jess Newman is the Deputy Political Director for United for Respect and is a member of the Invest in My Kids Coalition, and she's been kind enough here to join us here for a few minutes to talk about this proposal. Jess, thanks so much for being on Left of Lansing.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Invest in My Kids. And let me just say the my is MI, of course, is a proposal that is seeking, as I said, to add money here for education. Can you talk about how this proposal accomplish that goal?
Yes, absolutely. So Invest in My Kids is a crucial initiative that we are, as you said, working to get qualified for the 2026 ballot. And it's really simple. It is a new 5% tax on the ultra wealthy. So folks that make over $500,000 a year or over $1 million if they file with a partner, we're taxing every dollar they make over that at 5%. And that's going to raise over $1 billion in a year to fund our public schools in Michigan. So specifically, we're going to be funding smaller class sizes, career and technical education, and recruiting and retaining these high-quality teachers across the state. But if you've been paying attention to what's going on in Lansing, you can see why creating this dedicated funding mechanism is so crucial.
This surcharge here that you're talking about, this is for people, as you said, like I think a single filer would be $500,000 and joint filers $1 million, right?
That's right.
But they don't get taxed that until after that first $500,000 or $1 million?
That's exactly right. That first $500,000, you're free and clear. It's at that same flat rate of 4.25%. It's every dollar over that, right? So just taxes can get confusing for people. It's a marginal rate, right? So every dollar over $500,000. So that $500,000 and $1, that $1 will get taxed at the 5% rate. So very targeted. And we're talking about maybe a total of about 18,000 maximum households in the state that are going to get hit by this.
Well, let me just ask the elephant in the room kind of question, because I've been covering a little bit about what's happening in New York City with their mayoral race and some of the ideas that the Democratic nominee there, Zoran Mamdani, a Democratic socialist, he's proposing that going to have to raise some taxes to help fund some things like transit and affordable housing and things like that. And of course, you're hearing some from the other side saying, oh, that will just force the rich people of New York City to have to just move out and go elsewhere. I'm assuming you're hearing a similar pushback on this proposal in a similar way.
So I've heard that from maybe a handful of people. I will tell you, I've been out there talking to thousands and thousands of voters, and I have mostly gotten tax the rich, say less. It's time for them to pay their fair share. They can afford it. The handful of people that have said that, we have demonstrable proof that that's just not true, right? So first of all, Massachusetts passed an almost identical initiative in 2022. Not only have they seen an enormous amount of growth in revenue for these critical goods and services that they provide to all citizens across the state, they've actually seen a growth in the number of millionaires that have moved to their state. I think the bottom line here is, and you can say the same when you're looking at high tax environments in places like California and New York and Connecticut, people move where they're going to have a good quality of life. If you're actually thinking back all the way to the 1950s and 60s here, just in Detroit, where I'm based, we used to tax millionaires at a 90% marginal rate. At that point in time, we were considered the Paris of the Midwest. We had some of the best public schools in the country. And those are the kinds of things that attract high-level earners to stay and remain in place and build community. People want to live where things are good, where the trash is collected, where the roads are drivable, and there's museums and culture and public life that they want to be part of. So A, we just know that's not true. And we know that's not true because B, we know people want to live in places where they can thrive, where their communities are beautiful.
So this is unlike, maybe what we saw with the budget fight where the legislature agreed on a tax on marijuana, for instance. This isn't going to be put on the backs of the working class then.
Exactly. That's exactly right. This is our first spark in a fight to be demanding more. We need to raise revenue, right? That is an unavoidable fact. When you want to pay for good things, you've got to raise the money to pay for them. The question is, how do you do it? Do you do it on the backs of the working class by taxing things like everyday goods and services that the working class needs, or tax, sin taxes, similarly regressive, right? Or do you go after the people that can afford it? Are you going after the extremely wealthy, the people who, by the way, just got a massive tax break at the federal level, but certainly can afford to pay their fair share? Do you go after corporations who've gotten years and years of tax breaks thrown at them because we have been lied to that is the only way that you can spur development and get nice things? Those are the choices that we make, and we're positing that there is a different way, that we can go after the people that should be paying their fair share and who, by the way, right now pay less in taxes than someone making under $30,000 a year. I believe it, and there's a whole movement of people behind me that believe that is possible too.
I agree. Before we just move a little further, can you talk about this coalition? Maybe you could just share with everybody how this idea surfaced and how this coalition came together.
Yeah, so this is building on over a decade of organizing among parent and teacher organizing groups, community organizations, good government groups, unions that believe in this truth that we can grow the pie to provide all of the things that we need to create a thriving community and a healthy Michigan that serves all of our needs. So this particular iteration of the fight was called Babies Over Billionaires. And this group came together to say, we have been underfunding our schools to the tune of about almost $5 billion a year, adjusted for inflation, and that our kids, our teachers, our educators, our communities deserve better. And one of the ways that we're going to do that is by going after the folks that need to pay their fair share to fund the services that they need to thrive, that they need to make their businesses successful. So this group of organizations like 482 Forward, my organization, United for Respect, we are now a growing coalition. We just got the Detroit Federation of Teachers endorsement last week. The Grand Rapids Education Association's formally endorsed Avondale School Boards. This is a growing coalition of educators, everyday citizens, and organizations that care deeply about building a Michigan that serves every resident from birth to being in their old age, and doing so in a way that's equitable and makes sure that we don't have to just accept less, that we can fight for more. And so we've been out in the field and organizing towards the Invest in My Kids initiative for over the last 2 years, and have now thousands of people across the state, all volunteers, collecting signatures. If you're going to a farmer's market, you're probably going to see us out there with our clipboards. And it's truly a beautiful thing to see. People moved by the need to grow the pie, to stop robbing Peter to pay Paul, and to say that we deserve more and we can do more and do right by our kids and our communities.
You just alluded to it, but, from 2003 to 2010, like you said, K through 12 funding for schools that fell. I think you said when it was adjusted for inflation around, $3.54 billion, something like that?
$4.5 billion.
$4.5 billion. Yeah. So that gap, you're hearing some people say, oh, yeah, well, the funding is increasing the last couple of years. Okay, that's true. But that gap cannot just be simply filled in just a couple of years, right?
Absolutely not, right? And this has been a problem, to your point, since the Great Recession. We have seen our legislators and elected officials opine that we simply just have to get by with what we've got, that there's simply no way for us to increase the revenue that we're putting towards these crucial goods and services. So you're seeing that in the budget fight that just happened last week, for example. And this is something that, again, is a historical pattern. Rather than finding new sources of revenue, growing the amount of money that we're putting toward all of these crucial things that we are providing, like education, like roads funding, right? But also for our higher education, early education services, what we're doing is seeing them play shell games. So, we primarily see that our schools are funded through the sales tax. This happened because of Proposition A, which changed the funding formula and the way that we raise revenue for these things. And rather than taking money out of the general school aid fund, which technically the legislature is not allowed to do, what they're doing is moving new expenses into it. So, for example, we saw our general fund moved $750 million into the school aid fund. And at the same time, we saw $400 million in new new expenses from higher education moved into the school aid fund. So what was being separately funded, what was being separately, given revenue is now going to be pulling from that same bucket of revenue that was being used for our K to 12 schools. So while it may sound like, we've increased per pupil funding, first of all, that per pupil funding increase, when you're looking at the rest of the country, we're behind by at least $5,000 per pupil spending.
Yeah.
So not in and of itself, by the way, a record increase. But you're also seeing that we're increasing the amount of things that this fund has to pay for at the expense of these necessary buckets of funding. We did see good things come out of this budget, right? We've seen increases in funding to support English language learners, and a couple of other really good things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the thing that we take exception to is the idea that we have to be funding roads at the expense of our kids and vice versa. That is what we take exception to. That rather than being creative, rather than having the courage to grow the funding that we need for all of these things, we are playing games with the funding that we do have and shortchanging our kids in the process. And so this is a coalition that's come together to say enough is enough, and we're not going to accept less than what the working people deserve.
Right. I mean, it doesn't have to be a trade-off then if this proposal were to pass, because, you wouldn't have to say, well, if we're going to have to pay for roads or, like you said, even higher education, all right, well, then we're going to have to take money from here and pull it over here, pull it out there. So this proposal then, it doesn't matter who's in charge either, right? Who's in the majority, if it's Democrats or Republicans, because this money would be constitutionally locked in by the voters, right?
That's exactly right. So that's one of my favorite things about this proposal is that the legislature is not allowed to spend the money that's raised through this brand new tax. This is a new tax that is raising revenue that is constitutionally restricted for those three purposes of smaller class sizes, funding career and technical education, and recruiting and retaining our teachers. We get annual audits, and if it's spent in any other way, that would be an unconstitutional act by the legislature. So they have to spend it in those three ways. But Pat, I am going to be real, right? The reason why we are building this coalition, why we are mobilizing thousands of people to fight for these things, to fight for growing revenue and for fully funding our public schools, is because the fight won't be over. Even though these things are restricted to those three buckets of funding, we need to continue to push on our leaders to stop playing shell games with the rest of our revenue, right? And to say that we must grow the pie for everything else too. So yes, these three buckets, they're constitutionally protected, and we need this coalition to continue that fight to say that we deserve more, because we've seen that we can't trust that our elected officials are going to do right by us without that pressure from below.
I don't know if you saw a recent study by Michigan State University. I think it came out just a few months ago, where it reported that Michigan's per pupil spending, as we've been talking about here, remained relatively flat here for the last 3 decades. And it also put in there some recommendations, including raising revenue, which we know in Michigan would be hard to do. And this same MSU study pointed out a problem that you've already addressed. And that's, as of 2022, I think Michigan has the 5th lowest tax burden among all states. Now, at a time when I thought we were trying to figure out ways to attract younger people to Michigan, younger families to Michigan. I don't know. I suppose I always had this out of left field kind of idea that, investing more in our schools, kids, teachers, all that might offer one solution at bringing younger families to the state, because cutting taxes, as we've seen, hasn't exactly brought Michigan all the solutions. And even more, your proposal, again, aims at not only changing that mindset, but it's also ensuring that the working class, again, does not have to pay the brunt of it.
Exactly. Right. And I think some broader context here that I think is important is that this is a proposal that's grown out of this larger coalition of groups that are part of what's called the Fund My Future Coalition, which is a year-long conversation about how do we grow revenue for all of these great things. And I bring that up because, first of all, I lived in Washington, D.C. for several years. I'm born and raised here in Michigan, moved out to D.C. to start my career. And I really had a tough time moving back because I didn't have a car for nearly a decade. And that was great. And so knowing that I would have to not only have a car payment, but have to drive everywhere I needed to go, it was a really hard thing for me to decide to do, even though I love Michigan and wanted to move back here. And I've moved back for 8 years, and I do not regret a single minute of it. And, I think that that's a calculation that I know many people have made that have moved away that want to come back. I say that at the same time as I remember watching the Amazon HQ2 bidding process. I don't know if you remember that whole
I do.
Those shenanigans. And one of the things that came out of their analysis of why they rejected Detroit as one of the cities that they would be expanding to is because we had a dearth of high quality public schools and public transportation. To your point, we did not have the elements of the things in place to attract high quality talent to move here, to stay here and build their life here to a degree. Now, granted, did I want HQ2 here? Personally, no. But I do think it was illuminating, right? What they found, the SOAR projects, the insistence that we have to be throwing tax breaks at these multi-million-dollar corporations to build the communities that we see is just not borne out. And that simply by getting corporations and ultra wealthy people to pay what they owe, that we can build the communities that we need to thrive. I bought my home in Ferndale because it's a walkable community with great public schools and downtown thriving nightlife that I don't need to drive my car to get to, and great public goods and services. I chose this community because it provides the quality of life that as a young person I'm seeking here in Michigan. And so our assertion is there is no reason why every community across the state of Michigan cannot build a beautiful, thriving community with strong public schools and a strong public life that attracts these young families.
Just before I forget, when we were talking about how state funding for K through 12 public schools, that fell by over $4 billion during that 15-year period. That also led to Michigan's teacher shortage that has never recovered either, correct?
That's absolutely right. There was actually reporting over the last several months about Grand Rapids in particular has been struggling with this. And I know this is also a problem in our Upper Peninsula. Salaries here are abysmal for teachers. I have a good friend who's been a teacher for over 20 years, and she has 2 jobs. That's not an uncommon thing to encounter folks. And I'll say, too, as I've been circulating, I've met many current and former educators or folks who have people in their family that are current teachers. And without fail, every single one of them say, either they left the profession or think about leaving the profession, not because they don't love what they do, but because they just can't afford it. They're just not paid enough. And not only are they not paid enough or not compensated enough, we're talking about now teachers who are in charge of classrooms with 35, 40 kids, and you're just not able to give the level of individualized attention that they so desperately want to give. They do their best, right? And they work hard every day to provide a high quality education to their kids because they care. And at a certain point, they just don't have the resources at their disposal to do the job in a way where they feel like they're doing right by their kids, even as much as they try. And so between stagnant wages and a lack of resourcing that allows them to do a job that's really difficult and really important that they really care about, we've seen a lot of people leave the profession and leave the state for other opportunities. So this is really our effort to try to stem that tide by increasing the level of funding that these districts have access to recruit and retain these folks that really want to do this job and care about it very deeply.
All right. Well, Jess, for those who would like to learn more about the Invest in My Kids proposal and would like to help spread the word and volunteer in your efforts, where should they go and what can they do?
Investinmykids.org, and you can sign up easily on the website, take our circulator training. There's a list of places for you to go out right away, pick up your petition sheets. We have new folks signing up and joining us every single day. We're having a lot of fun out there. So investinmykids.org to sign up. We will get in touch with you to make sure that you're all set up with us, but we are going to be out at farmers markets, cider mills, holiday parties, wherever there is an event happening across the state of Michigan. You can join us to circulate and also come out and find us to sign. So investinmykids.org, I'll say it a third time.
and confident that you'll be able to get all the signatures in?
Yes, absolutely. Like I said, we're growing that movement every day. Listeners of this podcast are going to be a crucial part of that movement, but this movement is growing. Like I said, we've added new endorsers to this coalition just in the last 24 hours. So that momentum is undeniable. And I am more than confident you're going to see us on the ballot next year.
Well, this would make our taxing system here in Michigan a little more equitable.
Just a little.
And it's just a little. That's right. And it would be an investment, a much needed investment in the state's education and in the state's students and teachers, and a much needed, if I can say, first step to turn things around here. Jess Newman, member of the Invest in My Kids Coalition, thank you so very much for talking about all your work here with this initiative. And I'd love to have you on again soon once you're able to get all the signatures and this proposal is on the ballot officially.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And I'd come back anytime.
He's spent nearly 25 years working as a liberal voice in conservative talk radio across the state, and he's still a somewhat stable person. It's the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. You can find archives of the podcast, plus Pat's musings on other topics in written form at leftoflansing.com. Left of Lansing archives are available wherever you get your podcasts. And now Left of Lansing is available on YouTube. We'd like to thank Audio Boom for distributing all our episodes so we can share progressive, otherwise known as common sense, values across Michigan and the country. Now, here's Pat Johnston.
Special thanks to Jess Newman for joining us to talk about the Invest in My Kids ballot initiative. I will provide links to Invest in My Kids and also to United for Respect, where Jess is the deputy political director there. But you see, progressive values and progressive policies have ways to bypass the political corporate turmoil and gridlock in Lansing, and that is through the ballot initiative process. So please make sure to sign those petitions and also, if you can, help out with the movement. And one more note, special thanks to our good friends Gina, Julie, and Adrian from the progressive powerhouse in Michigan that is Distill Social. They assisted in getting me in contact with Jess Newman, and I am forever grateful for their help. So please check out and subscribe to their awesome podcast called Point of Disorder, as they also cover Michigan's and the nation's political scene as well. Time now for the Left of Lansing Last Call.
Any reaction to Bad Bunny being chosen as the Super Bowl halftime performance?
I didn't even know who Bad Bunny was, but it sounds like a terrible decision, in my view, from what I'm hearing. What's that?
How come?
Well, it sounds like he's not someone who appeals to a broader audience. And I think, there's so many eyes on the Super Bowl, a lot of young, impressionable children. And I think, in my view, you would have Lee Greenwood or role models doing that, not somebody like this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, that was hipster Mike Johnson. I guess he's also known as the MAGA Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives in D.C. He apparently doesn't have time, to end the budget shutdown by helping Americans receive their Medicaid or by simply extending Obamacare tax credit subsidies that will end up costing his constituents and hundreds of thousands of Michiganders thousands and thousands of dollars due to rising health insurance premiums if those tax credits aren't extended. No, Mike Johnson doesn't have time for that, but he did have time to opine on the NFL's announcement that Puerto Rican rapper Bad Bunny will be this season's Super Bowl halftime performer, because that takes the utmost importance. Now, I have to admit, I'm not much into the rap scene nowadays. Well, one, because I'm old, and two, I still don't think anyone could ever top Tupac, and I won't apologize for saying that. Now, that being said, I have seen Bad Bunny perform numerous times, and I've seen him appear in interviews. I've also seen him on shows like Saturday Night Live, where he's actually pretty good at being funny. For example, he was the host for SNL's opening night last week, and he spoke some of his monologue in Spanish. And then he said, for those who didn't understand what he said, they've got 4 months to learn. Now, that was pretty good. And just looking at numbers alone, Mike Johnson simply just doesn't understand anything if he really believes Lee Greenwood would provide better entertainment for a Super Bowl Sunday than Bad Bunny. Now, let's see. We have one guy whose only hit song, God Bless the USA, never charted on Billboard's Top 100 when released in 1984. It did reach number 16 after the 9/11 attacks. So good for him that his song got big after that tragedy. Not his fault whatsoever. That's the free market. I'm fine with it. And I will be fair. Lee Greenwood did have some country songs that were hits years and years ago. But compare with Bad Bunny, who was the most streamed artist on Spotify for a couple of years in the 2020s and has sold millions upon millions of records worldwide. Not only that, but he's a supporter of LGBTQ plus rights, and he is an outspoken advocate for Puerto Rico, which is part of America. And that's something that white Christian nationalists like Mike Johnson probably never could understand or probably never even knew. But most of all, he's an international star. And why does MAGA not understand why the NFL is going with Bad Bunny as their next Super Bowl performer? You see, the league, everyone, is a business. And as the Detroit Free Press's Keith A. Owens wrote this week, this ain't about Bad Bunny. It's about the economic power represented by the rest of the world that isn't white. And it's about the NFL having enough business sense to acknowledge that power. It's all about the money. He's right. Show me the money. It's about the free market, MAGA. And the NFL isn't just a whites-only league, and nor is it just played in America, as there is a game this weekend in London. Yeah, that's right, in London. Bad Bunny will get people to move, and he'll bring the younger viewer eyeballs to the show, which is exactly what the NFL wants. You really think 83-year-old Lee Greenwood's got that kind of juice? I don't think so. Besides, I defy anyone with a good critical ear for music to tell me that Lee Greenwood's I'm Proud to Be an American song is a good song. Come on, it is slop. And it's not even in the same ballpark as Ray Charles's rendition of America the Beautiful, or even Neil Diamond's Coming to America Today.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Left of Lansing. Again, my thanks to Jess Newman from Invest in My Kids for being on the show here this week. And please let me know what you think of the show. And hey, you can tell me if I'm wrong about Lee Greenwood. That's leftoflansing@gmail.com. Hey, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Michigan State education researcher Josh Cowan, who also authored a great book called The Privateers: How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. Well, Josh put his name in the ring to run for Michigan's 7th Congressional District, which is currently being held by MAGA Republican Tom Barrett. And Josh just announced here this week that he is ending his candidacy. And while that does suck, I am sure that Josh will keep up the good work that he's been doing for many, many years. And I can't wait to talk with him back here on the show real soon. One more thing. As I recorded this episode, the Detroit Tigers finally learned the major goal in baseball is to hit the ball and score runs, because the Bats finally awakened as they trounced the Seattle Mariners in Game 4 at Comerica Park, forcing a series-deciding Game 5 back in Seattle on Friday night. So I get to say this at least one more time. Go Tigers! And, of course, go Lions! And remember, take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan!
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, yes, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.